everybody, and welcome back to Security in the 21st Century. I'm your host, Dr. Suzanne Loftus. I'm pleased to have with me on the show today Dr. Brian Taylor, Professor of Political Science in the Maxwell School at Syracuse University. Brian, thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, thank you, Suzanne. I appreciate the invitation.
Brian is an expert on Russian affairs, amongst other things, and has recently, or in the last few years, written a book called The Code of Putinism. I thought we'd start off by discussing this book a little bit. So in your book, you describe that there is a code of conduct between Putin and his elite circle. And this code is responsible for guiding both foreign policy and domestic policy behavior and decision-making. So understanding this code could really help us basically understand the moves that Russia has been making in the last several years, as there does seem to be a bit of a lack of understanding from the West of Russian behavior. So maybe you could enlighten us and share with us what the main values, ideas, and emotions that shape this code are.
Thanks for that question. So the idea behind the book is to try and unpack a bit the mentality of what I refer to as Team Putin. So Putin and his closest advisors, those people who've been with him for decades and tend to have a similar worldview to Putin. And my kind of launching off point scientifically or academically is Max Weber's notion that there are four different impulses that lead to human action. And the first of those is instrumental rationality, which is what a lot of people tend to focus on, thinking about sort of means in short-term rationality that drive actors. And while not discounting that, I am interested in thinking about how the other three factors that Weber mentions influence human behavior, and especially Putin and his team. So Weber also talks about what he calls value rationality, which we can think of as values or ideas, affect, which we can think of as feelings or emotions, and habits or traditions. And so what I do in the book, based on Putin's speeches of those people around him, looking at his policies, talking to experts in Russia, that sort of thing, who looked at him closely, is try and come up with a short list of what the key ideas and values, emotions, and habits are of Putin and his inner circle. So some of the ones I focus on in terms of ideas are things like statism, the importance of a strong state, as well as the importance of Russia being a great power internationally. Illiberalism or conservatism, you can sort of think of it in either way, but sort of an opposition to liberalism as a way of organizing society, a more conservative kind of hierarchical approach. And then I also argue that one of the core ideas is an anti-Americanism that animates a lot of what they're doing. In terms of emotions or feelings, I look at things like the importance of respect to Putin and the people around him, or the flip side of that would be humiliation. Also feelings that Russia is vulnerable, both as a political system and internationally, and resentment about how Russia has been treated by the West since the end of the Cold War. And then finally, in terms of habits or traditions, I talk about things like importance of control, importance of order, loyalty, unity, and also hypermasculinity as these kind of, they're habits in the sense that they're kind of non-reflective reactions to what's going on in the world. They're deeply ingrained kind of things. So those are the roughly a dozen things that I sketch out as being the core of what I call this code, or what you can think of as a mentality. And then I try and use it to explain what happens in terms of domestic policy, economic policy, and foreign policy.
Well, that's very enlightening. We can certainly see elements of all those in their foreign policy, more specifically these days. However, you do mention that the Code of Putinism kind of veers Russia into a direction where it's underperforming domestically and is acting in an overambitious manner internationally. So how would you explain that?
Yeah, so in terms of underperforming domestically, I mean, I think we should say that Putin's record overall over the 20 plus years now he's been in power is mixed, right? They had a lot of economic success in his first 8 or 9 years or so in power, and much less success in that respect since then. In terms of other domestic attributes like the ability of the state to kind of set goals and carry them out in terms of the capacity of the state and its governance capability. I look at how they perform in a variety of areas, whether it's economic management or transportation and roads policy, healthcare policy, law enforcement. So I look at a series of different areas and then compare Russia over time to how it's improved or not improved, and also compare Russia to countries that are similar to it internationally in terms of being either upper middle income countries like Russia is, or one of its partners like a BRICS country like India or China or Brazil, and think about how Russia performs in a variety of areas and look at international indicators. And we see that Russia domestically actually doesn't perform as well in certain things like rule of law, like control of corruption, those sorts of things, as one might expect given its level of development. And so the way I bring the code into this is I talk about how the importance of control, the primacy attached to the state, the sort of feelings of vulnerability lead them to make policy decisions that have closed the political space, but also made it harder for them to kind of manage political processes in the way that they might like. They'd be better off if they used less what Putin calls manual control and relied more on a multitude of institutions to kind of make the domestic system work. And so that's how I see the code leading to underperformance at home. In terms of overambition abroad, in the foreign policy chapter, I look at how Russia, in terms of a couple of key indicators of global power, like the size of its economy or the size of its population, is really in a much weaker position than they've been for several hundred years, just in terms of those two indicators. Now, a lot more goes into global power, obviously, than economics and demographics. But even so, we find Russia sort of struggling to come to terms with the fact that it is no longer as powerful as it was during the Cold War era or even in the 19th century, and trying to find its role in the world and expecting to sort of be on the status of the United States and China, which in some respects it is, but in other respects it really isn't anymore, and how that leads it to try and pursue a series of policies to control the Eurasian space, the former Soviet territory, which really I think ends up in the long run weakening Russia's position in the world rather than strengthening it. And to tie it back into the code again, I think this has to do with notions about Russia as a great power, long-standing resentment at how it was treated by the West, and those sorts of factors that maybe inhibit a more flexible foreign policy that ultimately might be more successful.
Well, thanks for sharing that with all of us. In the field of Russian studies, as I am also in it, I've seen as we try to discern Putin's actions and the decisions of Russia in general, there are of course arguments that are more cultural, arguments that are more structural, and argue that Russia has always been an authoritarian country and had a very brief period where it tried to democratize, and that perhaps it's a political culture that is guiding Russia more towards this authoritarian direction and less towards liberalizing and modernizing the way a Western society would. But then you have other arguments that are more about agency. Michael McFaul makes this argument, and you make this argument as well. And I was just wondering, could you please just give us briefly what the main arguments are for those pushing more for agency, and why you're more of a proponent of this type of argument than the structural one?
I mean, I think that's a really good question. And one of the objections I sometimes get to the line of argument I make in this book is that what I'm describing as Putinism is really Russianism, that this is much more kind of deep-seated, that there are long traditions that derive from geography and history and culture that pattern sort of Russian behavior in the international system. And I'm more inclined to think that Russia has a range of choices. So rather than seeing history kind of as a circular phenomenon where we see the same patterns over and over again, I see it as more kind of linear, and different possibilities open up at different times in the country's history. So although it's true that Russia has for really almost all of its history, been an authoritarian country. Uh, for many countries, that was true for centuries as well. And it's only recently they've become democratic, but they become democratic because their societies have changed. And I see a Russian society that's changed a great deal since the time of Catherine the Great, or Nicholas the First, or Stalin. It's much more urban, it's much more literate and educated, it's much more professional, and it's got the type of society that in other places around the world has led to more open kind of political systems. And so although Russia does have these traditions, I don't see these as being kind of handcuffs that require it to behave only in one certain way. On the other side of the agency debate, there are those who also take a more kind of rationalist approach, what political scientists would call rational choice approach, and say that Putin behaves the way he is not because he's Putin, but because he's a rational autocrat trying to maximize his power and wealth in his own political system. So I'm kind of trying to steer between the kind of cultural determinist, kind of more structural approach, and an approach that really sees all autocrats as behaving basically the same, and say, well, there are actually distinct ways of understanding the world that Putin and the people around him have, and you can't explain some of the most important phenomenon we see in Russian politics without those. And just a couple of quick examples. One is the way he has surrounded himself with people he knew from the KGB, with people he knew from the St. Petersburg mayor's office, and he really has a team with a united view, and he really only puts people he considers loyal into the most important positions. And we see a great longevity of these people. And a different leader might have taken a different approach to managing personnel, I think, that might have led to different outcomes. Or if we think of a foreign policy decision, such an important one as the annexation of Crimea, I don't see that as simply given due to international structural factors, and I don't see it as a completely rational response either. I think there was a bit of emotion there that Putin felt that the West was responsible for what had happened in Kiev and Ukraine, and was angry about it and frustrated with the rest and resentful about it. And this was his way of kind of striking back at those feelings. So there were certainly geopolitical considerations at play. I wouldn't discount those, but I don't think we can understand all of the steps that he takes without trying to think more a bit about how he sees the world.
Yeah, well, that definitely makes sense, that a different leader would have taken different decisions and possibly veered the country in a different direction. The one interesting thing about Putin, though, is his enormous level of popular support. So where does the population of Russia play a role here? Do they truly support what he does, or is it that they don't have access to other type of information than the narrative of the Kremlin, or that they simply are apolitical, or what is it that really motivates them to support his policies? Because we don't see too much rebellion.
Yeah, I think one of the maybe shortcomings of my book is it's very much elite centered, and Russian society is a fascinating and interesting topic, and it's kind of in the background of the book. So I think what you're asking is really, important in thinking about it. It is the case, though, that in the sorts of personalistic authoritarian regimes like Russia is, especially in the realm of foreign policy, that it is a more kind of elite-centered decision-making process, right? But the question of support for Putin is an interesting and important one. I think there are several things we can point to. I mean, I think it's pretty clear that a lot of his support in his first two terms came from the economic turnaround that started in 1999 and continued through 2008, right? The economy was growing at 6.5%, 7% a year. People's living standards were rising. Things seemed to be getting better. It's not surprising under those circumstances that his popularity began to grow. And then if we look at the last decade, in which the economy has been much more sluggish and even stagnating, then the question of why the continued support when living standards are falling, I think it's a bit more interesting. And I think the first thing we can refer to is the big effect that the annexation of Crimea had on the popular support for Putin at home. That was a really cathartic moment for Russian society. Many people felt a sense of pride that Russia was sort of rising from its knees, as they put it, and that sort of thing. And I think that's because, in some ways, the narrative that was being propagated by state media, which plays an important role here, in some ways resonated with feelings that people had, feelings about how the West had disrespected them as they saw it, that Soviet contribution to winning World War II had been undervalued, and how important that event was in Russian popular memory, feelings of their society and even civilization being a distinct and unique one that wasn't being valued in the world. All of those things kind of resonated with ideas that were also familiar to people from the late Soviet period. And I think the regime used those quite effectively and propagated them through the media. There's a new book about this called The Red Mirror by Gulnaz Sharafutinova, where she talks about the way that the frames used today by the media under Putin resonate really well with those from the late Soviet period and sort of receive that support. And the final point I guess I would make is, I think it's important to remember that these popular approval ratings take place in a political system in which lots of potential opposition politicians are denied access to the political space, denied access to media. The state really aggressively shapes the television media content. It picks on narratives that it knows will resonate while isolating other kinds of narratives. So you don't see the kind of similar political phenomenon that you would have in a democracy, where there's lots of space for opposition politicians, opposition political parties, various media to put a spotlight on issues that might engender more discomfort with the domestic population. You don't hear those issues talked about regularly on state TV in the way that you might hear if you had a freer and more open political system with strong opposition parties. So some of the support is real, but some of it, I think, is a product of the political system that Russia has today.
Yeah, that makes sense. It would be really interesting to see, though, if another leader did come into to power and was more liberal and went into a more Western direction, if that would be well received among the population or not. But I guess there's no way of really knowing unless it happens someday. Also, in your foreign affairs article, you mentioned that Putin and his domestic policy change there, where he kind of changed the constitution, not surprisingly. What type of implications does this change have for how Russia will be ruled after 2024? And what exactly are the changes that he made?
Yeah, this is a huge question for Russia watchers and Putin watchers today. 2020 was really the year for Putin to start to put in place the features of the political system as it'll look going forward. So after he was reelected in 2018, he was going to be in a situation where by 2024, he had to step down from the presidency. He would no longer be allowed to be president because of the term limits that existed in the then Russian constitution. And immediately the Russian elite started to get super nervous about this so-called 2024 problem and what will happen if Putin has to step down from the presidency. Will he appoint a successor? Will there be some kind of contest for power? And Putin, for a variety of reasons, was interested in stopping that conversation and sort of calming down the elite. Henry Hale has a really great book called Patronal Politics about the way politics work in the post-Soviet space. And one of the things that Hale finds is that in political systems in Eurasia, right, the former Soviet space, that are presidential and in which the president is aging and reaching the end of it's always been a he so far in the post-Soviet space, reaching the end of his political lifespan, they're often subject to domestic disorder. And that happens because the various elite clans who are competing for influence realize that the person in charge is going to be leaving the scene, and they start looking for who's going to be the next leader and battling for influence or trying to become that person themselves. So it was important for Putin to sort of tamp down all the anxiety about what was going to happen in 2024 by opening the door to remaining in power after 2024. So the most important change in the Constitution last year was the one that made clear that term limits that are in the Constitution won't apply to people who had served as president. So that means Putin and Dmitry Medvedev. Under the new Constitution, it's assumed that they've never been president before, so they could still have 2 more terms. So in theory, that means in 2024, Putin could run for re-election, and then in 2030, assuming he wins and stays in power, then he could run again, and so he could serve until 2036. So we're looking at a scenario in which, at least potentially, Putin could be in power for more than 36 years, which would make him the longest sitting Russian leader since Peter the Great. And we don't know what he plans to do. And it also depends, obviously, a bit on his health and the domestic political circumstances. But just by opening up that option, he changed the dynamic domestically. Now, there were other constitutional changes that took place at the same time. That was the most important one. But the other ones that did take place tended to strengthen the president even more so than already strong presidency that existed in the Constitution prior to that. So I would take that as a signal that he, at least now, is thinking seriously about the possibility of trying to extend his rule beyond 2024, because he really did put even more authority with the presidency. So it would be hard to imagine him taking a different role in that system, given the way the presidency has been further strengthened under the new Constitution.
Quite a move, and that will certainly not improve Western-Russian relations, unless the West, of course, adopts a completely different outlook on Russia. But that definitely won't happen. So you also mentioned that there's very little opposition inside Russia, but we're hearing a lot about Alexei Navalny these days. Who is he? Does he have a very strong support base, or is it minor? And how viable is his message among Russians?
The Navalny phenomenon is clearly one of the most important ones that we've seen in recent years. And as most of the viewers will probably know by now, he's now in prison. He was the victim of an attempted assassination attempt last year in 2020. And I think the evidence points pretty clearly at the Federal Security Service, the FSB, as being the ones who carried out this assassination attempt, given the location and the method of the poisoning, which used Novichok, a banned biological agent, right? And we also have the investigation into the way various FSB people were traveling around following him, not only in the period prior to that, but for years leading up to that point. So the regime clearly thought of him as a threat in some ways. And it does raise the question of how much support he had. Now, the problem we have is similar to the one I was referring to earlier in terms of the managed political system. It's hard to know exactly how much support an opposition political figure has in a situation in which he or she is not given access to the media in the same way, is not allowed to organize openly, is not allowed to create their own political party, not allowed to run for office and that sort of thing. The public opinion surveys we do have, they show kind of mixed things. The first thing that you see if you look at this is that in terms of figures of trust, right? If people are asked, which politicians do you trust the most? And then given an open-ended, question to answer, Navalny only gets about 4 or 5% in terms of responses, whereas Putin gets around 30%. So there's a big gap there. And then after Putin, it drops off quite a bit to 15% for the prime minister, and then 10% below for everyone else. But if we look at all of those people who get mentioned, right, the top 10 people get mentioned, all of them are part of the system except Navalny. He's the one person who's kind of outside the system. So I think it's fair to say that he is the most popular, genuine opposition leader in Russia. And then if you look at the question that's slightly different, if you ask people, do you support Alexei Navalny's political activities? he gets around 20% support, which is still obviously a minority of the population, but it's a much bigger number than 4 or 5%. And so it does show that at least some of his anti-corruption activities, the videos he produced with his team showing corruption among the Russian elite, do resonate with the Russian population, at least a segment of it, and do worry the Kremlin. They would not be taking the steps that they've taken to try and kill him, to put him in prison, to harass his movement and drive them underground, to prevent them from participating in elections if they did not see some kind of threat from his organization and what they are trying to bring to the attention of the Russian population. So the one time he was allowed to run for election in a more or less open election, although one can argue about that, was in 2013 when he was allowed to run for mayor of Moscow. And even though he didn't have access to television, he got 27% of the vote, which was second in the election. So, we don't know what would happen if the political system was different, but he does have at least some support from, decent sectors of the population that if the political environment changed, may open up new opportunities. But for the moment, his movement is under grave threat and grave pressure. And he, of course, is in jail indefinitely. I mean, his term is 2.5 years, but many people, 3.5 years, excuse me, many people assume he's going to end up staying in jail longer than that, as long as Putin stays in power.
Gosh, that was just awful what happened to him. But his support base, would you say it's mostly the youth and the urban youth?
He has, so if you look at opinion polls, it is clear that he does have more support among younger segments of the population, those 40 and younger. And it tracks fairly well with where people consume their media. So older Russians tend to rely on television as their main source of news, and younger Russians are more and more going to the internet and using YouTube and Telegram and Twitter and Facebook and other things as a source of news. And that tends to lead to quite different perceptions of what's going on in Russia and what's going on in the world, depending on where you get your primary source of news. So we are seeing that the current regime tends to be losing support among younger voters in recent years. For a long time, people were thinking that the next generation was going to be the generation of change. And there wasn't actually a lot of evidence for that. It seemed to be that younger people had similar views to their parents and grandparents for much of the Putin era. But in the last 2 years or so, we've actually seen quite a big shift. And there's some good work being done on this, showing that the youth are drifting away from the current government and looking for other sources, not just Navalny, but other journalists online and things like that, that I think raises a challenge to the Putin regime. How are they going to reach that group of voters? Or are they just going to rely on repression to keep themselves in control?
Yeah, that's yet to be seen. So moving on from Russian domestic politics, some of the main themes of this video podcast series include issues of great power competition with China and Russia, transatlantic relations, and disinformation campaigns. So I wanted to ask you, why is 2016 known as the year Russia won? We saw in 2016, there was the election of Trump, there was Brexit, there were Russian actions in Syria, the rise of European populism. So what does that signify for our geostrategic competition today? And is Russia winning in some way?
Yeah, so back in 2016, and this happened really right after Trump won the US presidential election, several commentators, both in the United States and in Russia, were talking about what a great year it had been for Russia. And they used the phrase the EU, it's the year that Russia won. 2016 was the year that Russia won. And I think there was a feeling that because of the events that you mentioned, not only the election of Trump, but Brexit, Russia's success in Syria, the seeming success of some of Russia's disinformation campaigns, that Russia was really kind of on the front foot and achieving its objectives internationally. I think looking back at 2016, now 5 years later, things don't look so clear cut. In fact, even at the time, there may have been reasons to suggest that it was an overstatement to say Russia, quote unquote, won. But if we look at, for example, in the last 7 years, the Russian economy has been basically stagnant, growing at about 0.3% a year. Living standards have declined by 10% over that time period for average Russians. And then internationally, I think we can see that although the Assad government is still in power, it's still really unresolved what Russia has achieved by that objective beyond keeping him in power, and whether a secure state can be built there. We do see some successes, in terms of its disinformation campaigns, but I think one of the things we can say in hindsight is that the Trump presidency was not perhaps as big a disruption to global politics as some people thought or feared or hoped it might be at the time. I mean, I think, when members of the Russian Duma were popping champagne to celebrate Trump's election, they imagined a completely different agenda for US-Russian relations, the kind that Trump had talked about as a candidate, where he was going to be friends with Vladimir Putin. And we saw that that didn't really happen under the Trump presidency, that although he talked very positively about Putin during his 4 years as president, the rest of the American government was not really on board with that message. Not only the Democrats in Congress, but the Republicans in Congress as well. And the sort of national security professional bureaucracy was much more suspicious of Putin in Russia than Trump was. So we saw that he had a hard time changing the direction of policy towards Russia on most important issues. And clearly now with the Biden presidency, we know that there is a concerted effort on the part of the US to reestablish close ties with our most important allies in Western Europe, to come up with a more comprehensive, coherent strategy towards Russia that we can work on with our allies. And that really, I think, puts this notion of Russia winning in a different light, because I don't think we see that they would really claim that they've achieved all their objectives in the international system over the last 5 years. Not at all. I think, like many states, they win some and they lose some. And so we're not seeing a one-way pattern with Russian international politics.
Yeah, exactly. But maybe it certainly has gained some attention, with the annexation of Crimea and then its actions in Syria, which helped bolster Assad in the region. So in some sense, probably its influence is increasing, even though it's declining as a power, which is a bit paradoxical. But also what you were mentioning earlier about how Russia kind of punches above its weight in foreign policy. So how about in terms of the transatlantic relationship? Do you think the allies see eye to eye on the threat of Russia, or are there differences?
Um, I think in general, by the allies, if we mean NATO in particular, uh, there's been quite a degree of consensus. I know probably where you're sitting, people are more kind of animated by talking about the differences one sees in Europe about Russia policy, and I will get to those. But I think overall, the fact that there's been the ability to sustain a sanctions policy around Russia's behavior in Ukraine has been something that maybe people wouldn't have expected back in 2014, that all of the sort of EU and North American countries would adopt sanctions and stick to those sanctions as long as Russia did not stop its support for separatism in the Donbass and not continue to hold on to Crimea. I think people wouldn't have expected the sanctions policy to necessarily stay in place. They thought it would have collapsed by now. So there is at least some degree of consensus on the baseline policy, on the importance of recognizing Ukraine's territorial integrity and right to exist within its borders. Now, obviously, there are differences both in terms of content and in terms of sort of style. I mean, I think there are some countries within NATO and within Europe, such as Germany and France, that want to try and figure out a way to have a more cooperative and sustainable relationship with Russia. And they realize that it's hard, but they think it's necessary to try, given Russia's status as a European great power. And there are other countries in the bloc, and I would put the UK potentially in this category, the United States, countries like Poland or the Baltic states, who really have the view that there's no cooperating with Russia right now. The policy needs to be one of containment. It needs to be one of deterrence, and that should be the emphasis. And they would point to a whole host of issues, not just Ukraine, but the Skripal attempted poisoning in the UK, the blowing up of ammunition depots in the Czech Republic, and a whole host of other issues where they would say it's simply not possible to cooperate with Russia at this point. So I think one of the interesting things we'll see in the Biden administration, and with the potential change in power in Germany, Angela Merkel will be out of power by the end of the year, French elections next year. Will the transatlantic alliance still continue to have a more or less unified view of Russia policy with some dissent here and there, or will the policy kind of unravel and we'll see a sharper break in the alliance? And I guess my own sense is it seems premature to count NATO out in that respect. I think the alliance has been quite successful throughout its history, and the fact that it still continues to maintain a consensus on some of these issues shows that there's more to be done in terms of NATO-Russia policy.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, we do tend to focus a bit too much on the differences between the alliance on how to approach Russia. But as you said, in general, the policies have remained firm and in place, and maybe that's all we really need. It doesn't matter if we have some slight divergences, as long as the main stance is relatively united. So. But then also there's the big problem of disinformation, and Russia is a great player in this realm. So do you think Russia lately is affecting the media space in a significant way? And if so, what type of narrative is it affecting the space with?
Yeah, well, clearly Russia is trying to affect the media space. I mean, they're not really shy about that. They have put a lot of money into things like RT and Sputnik. They're spending billions of dollars on its international media. So there is a big push by Russia in this respect. And I think if there's one overarching message, it's actually in some ways encapsulated well by the RT slogan, question more, right? Which is kind of a way of saying that we don't really want you to believe anything necessarily coherently. We just want you to be confused about what to believe. So their most effective kind of narrative tool is not to push one single message, but to put out a whole host of variant messages that lead people sort of discouraged and cynical about global politics. And I think that sort of plays into their hands more than having a whole bunch of people who are persuaded by the Russian view, just having a whole bunch of people who are kind of checked out and cynical about global politics and really see no difference between any of the actors in the international system. So I think that's a message that they push that works fairly well. And it's designed to kind of support the Eurosceptics, support the extremes on the left and the right in countries like the United States and countries in Europe, and therefore make it harder to hold together what some people like to refer to as the quote unquote liberal international order. Now, there's a big debate about how useful that scheme is, but I think people like Joe Biden and Angela Merkel probably believe there is something called the liberal international order, and it's important to sustain it. And I think we've seen from statements from people such as Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov that they also believe there's a liberal international order and they don't like it, and they would like to replace it with something else where Russia kind of has an equal seat at the table along with China, and maybe the United States, those big three can kind of set the rules of the game outside any American hegemonic liberal international order, which Russia would like to get rid of. So I think that's the basic message. Now, having said all that, sitting where I'm sitting in the United States, in terms of disinformation, from my view, the biggest problems are domestic, right? It wasn't anything Russia did that promoted the what they're now calling the big lie, that Trump actually won the 2020 election. It wasn't anything Russia did that led to the violent assault on the Capitol on January 6th. That's all homegrown stuff. I mean, the Russians may try and help here and there in social media, but when one of the two presidential candidates refuses to accept the results of the election, and when one of the two political parties, has a majority of its voters believing that the election was rigged, that's something that Russia could not do on their own. That's something that's happening because of domestic political issues in the United States. So I don't think we should overstate Russia's influence. We know what they're trying to do, at least in some ways, in terms of the global media environment, and they may have had some successes in that environment. But I think ultimately Western societies need to look inward to think about the way voters are receiving messages, who they're receiving them from, who has incentives domestically to put out misinformation, and try and work at that end of the angle at least as much and probably more so than the international angle. That's just my view, not so much as a Russia analyst, but as an American citizen, really.
Yes, definitely. That makes sense. But it's this element of doubt, as you were talking about, the way that the Russians kind of just put this piece of doubt in someone's mind, and it's already enough to kind of make them question everything. So, not that it's their doing, but we see this a lot in American society and European society, just doubt of the establishment, doubt that the government is honest. And it's an environment that's really suitable for more competing narratives and for propaganda and for people to actually believe things like the big lie or anything similar. It's people don't know what to believe anymore, and that's quite dangerous, I would say.
I mean, it's something that I'm concerned about too. I will, be frank and say it's not a main area of my research, but I have some colleagues at the Maxwell School at Syracuse University who study misinformation and disinformation directly. And one of the things that those scholars have found is that even when someone is told something that is not true, and they're told that it's not true, it still kind of has an effect. It still kind of lingers. It's an echo right in their head of misinformation that you can't ever entirely get rid of. So with the changing media landscape, with the move into social media, it's just so much easier for those messages to propagate, as opposed to the media environment I grew up in which there were 3 or 4 networks and the news was kind of always the same on all of them. And you read your paper and it was either a national newspaper like the New York Times or a local newspaper that ran stuff from the Associated Press. It was all kind of the same news, but the internet is not all kind of the same news. And so I think it's a really tricky issue for democracies about how to exist in an information environment in which there are so many variant voices, many of which are promoting outright falsehoods and disinformation. And you can't, as a democracy, simply close those outlets down, but you also need to figure out a way to reach your population and maybe teach people the critical reasoning skills to help them navigate that environment better than they have so far. But I agree with you. It's a real challenge, I think, for democracies going forward in the 21st century.
Yes, we're still trying to figure out how democracy can flourish in the age of information. So I think it's definitely a work in progress. Well, Brian, thank you so much for your time with us today. It was a real pleasure to have you on the show.
Thank you very much, Suzanne. I enjoyed the conversation. I appreciate the opportunity.
And to our audience, thanks again for tuning back in to Security in the 21st Century.